Hello, listeners, and welcome back to Genetics Unsealed, a podcast where I inform you of recent affairs in the world of genetics and biology, and I teach you stuff. Indeed. I'm your host, Folabumi Adeleke, and today I'll be discussing two separate but intertwined topics. I will be talking about race as a social construct and eugenics. So now we start. Okay, so let's begin with a simple but surprisingly difficult question. What exactly do we mean when we talk about race? In everyday conversation, race is treated as if it's something biological, something fixed, inherited and rooted in our DNA. Many people assume that humanity can be sorted into a handful of clearly defined groups: black, white, Asian, indigenous, and so on. These labels feel familiar, even natural. They even show up on census forms, medical paperwork, and government documents. They shape how people see themselves and how they are seen by others. But here's a crucial point. Biology doesn't recognize these categories, society does. When geneticists look at human DNA, they don't see the neat racial boxes that have been handed down through history. Instead, they see variation, gradients, and overlaps. Human populations blend into each other geographically because throughout history, people have migrated, mixed, traded, fought, loved in an ideal world, and settled together. There were no static, isolated groups evolving in perfect separation. You know, this could be the Yamnaya, Neanderthal farmers, etc. If you map human genetic diversity, what you get looks less like a set of isolated islands and more like a color gradient. Subtle shifts occur across distance, one population shading gently into the next. The idea of hard genetic boundaries simply doesn't match reality. And here's something even more fascinating. There is more genetic diversity within any single population than between populations. Two people from the same so called race may be more genetically different from one another than either is from someone in a different group. So, if race isn't genetic, where did it come from? Now, race emerged as a way for societies, particularly colonial empires, to classify, rank, and powerfully influence the lives of different groups of people. These categories were shaped by historical events, political agendas, cultural beliefs, and economic systems. They became embedded in institutions, laws, and social expectations. That means race is real, but its reality lies in social aspects, not biological. It affects people's experiences, opportunities, and treatment in the world, but it is not encoded in their DNA. This distinction is essential because when we confuse race with genetics, we risk reviving misconceptions that have caused real harm in the past, and we undermine our ability to understand what human genetics actually tells us. Modern genetics invites us to rethink the boundaries we inherited. Instead of rigid categories, we find a story of shared origins, interconnected histories, and a human family that is far more genetically united than divided. Do you understand why so many people still imagine race as a biological category? We need to travel back a few centuries to a time when science looked very different and when European empires were expanding across the globe. During the 18th and 19th centuries, naturalists and philosophers were obsessed with classification. They wanted to catalogue everything: plants, animals, minerals, and inevitably humans. This was the age of Linnaeus, hence Linnaean classification. This was the era of neat taxonomic boxes and Latin names. It was a time when the world was being discovered, or more accurately, colonized. Although, yeah, by European powers for the most part. and people encountered astonishing diversity they didn't yet understand. Faced with unfamiliar cultures and appearances, many thinkers attempted to impose order using the scientific tools they had. Unfortunately, these tools are primitive, and the assumptions behind them were deeply shaped by the politics of the time. Scientists measured skulls and facial angles, they compared skin tones, hair textures, and eye shapes, and then crucially, they ranked these traits, arranging human groups into hierarchies that placed Europeans conveniently at the top. These efforts weren't neutral, they were carried out within the context of colonial domination, the transatlantic slave trade, and the economic incentives to justify inequality. What emerged was not race science, but scientific racism, a collection of theories that claimed racial differences were fixed, natural, and indicative of intelligence, morality, or worth. Traits that we now know are influenced by environment, culture, nutrition, and complex interactions were presented as evidence of a mutable biological destiny. It is also important to note that many of the scientists driving these ideas were celebrated intellectuals of their day. They were respected, educated men, but they lived within a worldview that aligned scientific inquiry with the political needs of empire. And in that worldview, it was useful to believe that some groups were inherently inferior. These ideas seeped into every corner of society: anthropology, medicine, criminology, and even early psychology attempted to draw racial lines in human nature. Museums displayed skulls labeled as belonging to more primitive peoples. Textbooks repeated these claims as facts, and over time, the idea that humanity could be carved into biological races became part of the cultural landscape. This laid the groundwork for a far darker chapter: eugenics. If races could be ranked, then according to this flawed logic, they could also be improved or controlled. By the late 1800s, this pseudo-scientific framework shifted from merely classifying people to actively proposing who should reproduce and who should not. And although modern genetics has dismantled every single one of these assumptions, the legacy of those early racial theories remain. We still see echoes today in stereotypes, in biased algorithms, in health disparities, and even the way people talk about genes, as if they align with racial categories. Understanding this history helps us to recognize how deeply social and political forces have shaped the way we talk about biology, and why breaking free of those outdated ideas is essential for ethical science today. So, with race now entangled in the language of biology, and a society primed to believe that human groups could be classified, ranked, and compared, the stage was set for one of the most troubling movements in scientific history: eugenics. Eugenics began not in some obscure French corner of science, but right here in Britain. The term was coined in the late 19th century by Sir Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin. Galton was fascinated by heredity, statistics, and the idea of improving the human species, and he believed that desirable traits, intelligence, industriousness, even moral character, were inherited in a straightforward, predictable manner. Now it's easy today to look back and shake our heads, but at the time, genetics as we know it didn't exist. Mendelian inheritance had been rediscovered only recently. The complexity of gene environment interactions, epigenetics. I would actually record a book review of the book The Epigenetic Revolution somewhat soon. Continuing on, and polygenic traits was completely unknown. So Galton proposed something that seemed simple. If you can selectively breed plants and animals to make them stronger, faster, or more productive, why not humans? From this flawed logic came two categories: positive eugenics, encouraging the fit or superior to reproduce, and negative eugenics, discouraging or preventing the unfit from reproducing. Of course, the real danger lay in who got to define fit, and here's where prejudice entered the picture, dressed up as science. Throughout the early 20th century, eugenic ideas spread rapidly. They were embraced by politicians, academics, and social reformers. In Britain, this took the form of campaigns to institutionalize people with disabilities, proposals for selective marriage restrictions, and widespread public support for improving the nation's stock. While the UK never passed compulsory sterilisation laws, as many activists pushed for, British intellectual influence spread abroad, especially to the United States, where eugenics became embedded in law. In the United States, eugenics became a powerful force. Between the 1900s and the 1970s, over 60,000 people, disproportionately poor, disabled, or from marginalized ethnic groups, were forcibly sterilized. Some were told they were undergoing routine surgery, others were coerced or misled. A landmark Supreme Court case, Buck v. Bell, 1927, upheld the constitutionality of forced sterilization. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes infamously declared, "Three generations of imbeciles are enough." Carrie Buck, the young woman at the center of the case, was neither imbecile nor incapable. She had simply been born into poverty and had been assaulted by a relative, or was labeled genetically defective. Eugenic thinking also shaped early intelligence testing. IQ tests, originally developed to identify children who needed educational support, were distorted into tools for ranking races, judging immigration suitability, and labeling certain groups as inherently less intelligent. Results were interpreted through a biased lens. Immigrants who didn't speak English failed the test, declared feeble minded. People from different cultural backgrounds scored differently, called genetically inferior. Poor nutrition, limited education, and stress were ignored as factors. These flawed conclusions were then used to justify immigration restrictions and discriminatory policies. The most horrific manifestation of eugenic ideology appeared in Nazi Germany. Influenced heavily by British and American eugenic writings, the Nazis implemented compulsory sterilization laws, marriage restrictions, and systematic murder of disabled people under the Action T4 program. This ideology then expanded into racial hygiene, culminating in the genocide of Jewish communities, the targeting of Roma Slavic peoples and others deemed inferior, the attempt to engineer an Aryan population. Yeah, you really should have studied better. It's crucial to say clearly, eugenics provided scientific cover for atrocities, used biology as a weapon. And although the world rejected Nazi eugenics after the war, the underlying assumptions didn't disappear overnight. So why did eugenics spread so easily? Eugenics appealed to many because it offered a simple explanation for complex social problems, a promise of control on a rapidly changing world, a framework that reinforced existing prejudices, a scientific sounding justification for inequality. It was science stripped of nuance, ethics, and humility, and applied to devastating consequences. Today we know that traits like intelligence, mental health, and behavior involve hundreds of thousands of genes, intricate gene environment interactions, cultural, social, and economic influences, and random chance. Eugenics ignored all that. It reduced humanity to a set of crude labels and assumed they were biologically ordained. And while we may think we move far beyond such thinking, the temptation to simplify genetics, to believe in genes for complex behaviors, or to map social categories directly onto biology still lingers. This history matters because it reminds us of how easily science can be misused when stripped of context and exploited for political ends. Even though the scientific community has long moved past the idea that races are biological categories, society hasn't. The language of race is still everywhere, in media, in medicine, in pop culture, and in ordinary conversation. So it's no surprise that many people assume race must have some genetic basis. But why does this confusion persist? One major reason is that ancestry can be studied genetically. Companies like 23andMe or Ancestry DNA can tell you where your ancestors might have lived, what genetic variants you carry, and how your DNA relates to global population histories. But these results don't map cleanly onto modern racial categories. Someone might be 20% West African, 30% Irish, 10% Indigenous American, but none of these percentages correspond neatly to racial labels like black, white, or Latino. Those labels are cultural constructs that vary between countries, communities, and time periods. If you could think of genetics as a map of migration, not race, human beings naturally try to categorize people based on what we can see: skin color, hair texture, facial features. These create powerful social impressions, but these traits are shaped by a tiny fraction of our DNA, and they evolve largely in response to environmental pressures like sunlight and climate. They don't predict intelligence, behavior, moral character, ability, or anything else essential to personhood. Yet historically, people assume visible differences must reflect deeper biological divisions, a misconception that still shapes conversations today. Some diseases appear more common in certain populations, and this can look like evidence of racial genetics, but the picture is far more complicated. For example, sickle cell disease is associated with ancestry from regions with historical malaria exposure, not with blackness as a racial category. Type 2 diabetes in South Asian communities is influenced by diet, lifestyle, economic patterns, and colonial histories of famine, closely related to epigenetics, and not simply due to pure genetic predisposition by random chance or just something attributed to being South Asian. And high blood pressure in some groups is linked to chronic stress caused by discrimination, not racial DNA. Yeah. When social inequalities shape health, they can mimic genetic patterns. Without careful analysis, these patterns appear biological, and the cycle of misunderstanding continues. Even though eugenics was discredited, some of its assumptions linger. People still ask, People still ask, which race is the smartest? Which race is genetically superior at sport? Which race evolved first? All these questions rest on flawed premises, but their persistence shows how deeply scientific racism embedded itself into public consciousness. Genetics is complex, race is socially powerful. Trying to unite the two creates simple, seductive narratives, but they're wrong. Human diversity cannot be reduced to a handful of categories that are created by history, not biology. So if race isn't a biological category, what does genetics to reveal about us? It reveals a far more beautiful and interconnected story. Modern humans have only been around for about 300,000 years, a blink in evolutionary time. Because we're so young, we simply haven't had the time to evolve into separate biological races. Other species with longer histories and stronger geographic isolation do shows distinct subspecies. Humans, however, don't. We all trace our origins to Africa. Every person alive today can trace their ancestry back to African populations. From there, humans migrated across the globe in waves, mixing and intermingling constantly. This means all non African populations are essentially branches from African ancestors. African populations contain the greatest genetic diversity, and variation decreases the farther a population is from East Africa. This alone contradicts the idea of racial hierarchies. Human genetic variation forms smooth gradients across geography. There are no sharp breaks, no clean separations. What we see instead are population clusters, groups that reflect historical movement, not racial categories. These clusters don't allow modern racial labels. In fact, India alone contains more genetic variation than Europe. East Africans and West Africans can be genetically distant from each other as Europeans are from East Asians. Many indigenous Australian genomes diverged from other groups tens or thousands of years ago. Genetics reveals complexity, not simplicity. The majority of genetic differences are found within any given population. Only a small percentage distinguishes one population from another, and these differences don't align with social race categories. We are incredibly similar. Despite our visible differences, humans share humans share 100% of their DNA. We are one of the most genetically homogeneous species on the planet. We share 99.9. Our differences are often adaptive, not racial. Traits like skin pigmentation, lactose intolerant, lactose tolerance, altitude adaptation, and resistance to certain diseases are shaped by specific environmental pressures. They evolve independently in many different populations, a process known as convergent evolution. This means similar traits can appear in unrelated groups for similar reasons. Human genetic diversity is about adaptation, not racial essence. Eugenics may feel like a relic of the past, but its shadow stretches into the present in subtle ways. As our tools grow more powerful, from gene editing to embryo screening, the temptation to improve humanity resurfaces. This time it's framed in terms of optimizing health, eliminating future risk, enhancing generations, enhancing future generations. But we must be careful. Where do we draw the line between medical benefit and the new form of selective breeding? History warns us, even well intentioned science can slide towards discrimination if ethics aren't robust. Health inequality still echo eugenic thinking. Some policies with public narratives still blame poor people for their health, frame disability as a burden, treat certain bodies as less valuable, and assume biological explanation for social problems. These ideas might not use the word eugenics, but they spring from similar roots. As healthcare and policy systems adopt machine learning, there's a risk of baking historical racial biases into algorithms. If data reflects inequality, predictions will too, giving technological gloss to all prejudices. Pop culture loves the idea of genes for aggression, genes for genius, genes for criminality, but traits like these are never controlled by single genes. They are shaped by upbringing, environment, culture, chance, and thousands of genetic factors interacting in ways we don't currently understand. The moment we start using genetics to explain or justify social differences, we drift dangerously close to eugenic thinking. Understanding the legacy of eugenics allows us to challenge simplistic narratives about genetics, recognizing all ideas resurface in modern language, prevent scientific authority being used to justify inequality, approach genetic technology with humility and care. Modern genetics must be inclusive, transparent, fixed on health, not hierarchy, aware of historical misuse, and grounded in empathy as much as accuracy. The story of human genetics is one of connection, not separation, one of complexity, not simplicity, one of shared ancestry, and not racial division. Science cannot undo the harms of eugenics, but it can ensure that its mistakes are never repeated. So, thank you everyone for joining me on this episode of Genetics Unsealed. If there's one message to take away, remember this: race is real only as a social experience, and not as a biological category. Be vigilant. Do not let, if you can, as you may, do not let genetics be misused as it once was in the past, and in some ways is misused now. Until next time, I'm your host, Fulbumi Adeleke, signing out.